Today we're going to take a look at nonverbal communication. And if you look through the content section on D2L, you notice that I uploaded quite a few different quick links. You will see a segment from the movie Tootsie that identifies what we typically view as nonverbal behaviors that are masculine. And then on the reverse, the second quick link to a Tootsie video looks at Dustin Hoffman as he plays a traditional woman and exemplifies feminine characteristics that are nonverbal. One of the goals of nonverbal communication is to supplement our verbal interaction with one another. So sometimes I will use a hand gesture or a facial expression in addition to the word that I'm saying, and other times I will supplement that with my hand gesture or facial expression. So I'll use those nonverbals instead of words themselves. We use these nonverbals for a couple of reasons. One of them is to regulate our interactions with one another. We look at each other as we're speaking, and we signal to one another when we should start speaking, when we should stop speaking, when we're upset with an interaction, when we're confused, and which requires clarification. And we regulate that interaction in terms of who speaks and when with those nonverbals. The other thing we do with nonverbal behavior is establish a relationship level of meaning. So our responsiveness to another person, our liking of another person, our power over another person, all of these things are exemplified through the nonverbal behaviors that we choose. If you look at those two YouTube videos of Tootsie, when Dustin Hoffman plays a man, he uses very, very different nonverbal behavior than when he plays a woman. We see that his gestures are bigger, are broader. His voice is deeper, it's lower. He is louder as a man than he is as a woman. He uses more emotional facial expressions when he plays a woman rather than a man. And we'll understand why as we move forward through these slides. So here's the forms of nonverbal behavior. And one of the things I'm most concerned with you walking away with from this presentation is the ability to use these vocabulary words and understand what they pertain to. When we talk about artifacts, we're talking about objects or items that express and influence our identities. So if you take a look at the quick link that I've put on your D2L page, you will see a Lego commercial. This Lego commercial really tells us a lot about the influence of our society. We traditionally think of Legos as a masculine artifact, a boy's toy, if you will. And this time, we decide we're going to create them for a girl. We change their color, we change their context, and we change the relationship that that toy has with the child that's playing with it. It becomes pink and purple. The relationships between the figures gain more attention than the actual building itself, which was the traditional goal of Legos. And we see that there's clothing and hairstyles that go with the figurines that did not exist when this was a masculine toy. That's what we mean by an artifact. Other artifacts in our society would be jewelry as a feminine artifact. We may consider masculine artifacts to be objects such as motorcycles or snowmobiles. When we talk about those items, they tell us something about society. They tell us who's in charge. They tell us what the personality type is. They define masculinity and femininity through actual objects in society. The second area of nonverbal communication that we refer to is proxemics. This refers to our use of space. And when we look at our use of space, let's think about this. Are there any rooms in your home that are traditionally a man's room? Your father's room, your husband's room. These rooms traditionally in American society are the office, perhaps some sort of man cave or room where TVs are placed. We have very traditional perspectives on which artifacts belong in that room and how it's deemed masculine. On the reverse, perhaps the kitchen is considered the female room in the house. Perhaps the closets are considered female space. We also look at how we seat ourselves. Think of your dinner table growing up and where everybody sat. Was it gender specific? This is what we mean by proxemics. The third item, that we'll look at is haptics, the use of touch. The research tells us, and your textbook in chapter 6 tells us, women use touch more than men to communicate their messages. They communicate empathy and sympathy and their relationship status with another person through their use of touch. And we will see this in, we can use touch as a supplement to words. We can use it as a replacement to words. So sometimes we actually touch someone as we tell them that we're sorry. Other times, instead of telling someone to physically move from left to right, we move their body. But haptics, when we're studying them as an element of nonverbal behavior, typically exhibit some relationship status, whether it's responsiveness, likingness, etc. We also look at kinesics. This is our use of face and body movements. I challenge you to attempt to go one day without smiling at any other human being and see what happens. If you look at the example of this in Chapter 6 in your textbook, you'll see that the student who attempted this was very, very frustrated by it. People were continually asking them, what's wrong? How come you're not, you don't seem like yourself today? What we find is that women smile more than men. Women smile for things that actually don't make them happy. And we often use it as a greeting as much as a signifier of emotion. Men, on the other hand, use more aggressive movements. They tend to use more eye contact but sustain it for shorter periods of time. More broad generalizations or more broad gesturing in their physical demeanor. And women, on the other hand, tend to take up less space and use less of those types of movements. The next area we'll consider is paralanguage, the use of pitch, volume, inflection. Women tend to use more inflection, more emotion, for example, in their words. They use a softer volume and a higher pitch. The next and last area we'll consider is physical appearance. Physical appearance in American society takes on a totally different premise in terms of nonverbal behavior than other societies might have. When we talk about physical appearance, you can look to the quick link on your D2L page where I uploaded Killing Us Softly. This is an entire lecture series, and I've only got part 4 loaded in this section of D2L, where we examine what does media tell us about our physical appearance? What does our physical appearance exemplify about ourselves? What does it non-verbally communicate about expectation and perception in society? And when we see that 87% of men are satisfied with their appearance, we think, well, wow, that's a really good number. We, however, do not see that when we look at the female counter statistic. One of the things we also know about physical appearance is that it indicates a lot of different things about an individual. And so if you look at the chapter, one of the interesting sidebars in your chapter 6 is a student who talks about using a head covering as a Muslim woman. She looks at that object as being something where she no longer objectifies herself because her physical appearance is not what she's composed of. Rather, it's her personality, and by covering a piece of her body, she's able to exemplify that. In American society, we look at that artifact, that headdress artifact, as being some sort of oppressive measure for a woman, and when in fact women, or this woman of this given society, feels that instead it keeps her from being enslaved as an object. So what does this summarize to? The first thing is we have differences related to sex in our nonverbal language and behavior. They are reflected in our gender distinctions. Women are more sensitive to the nonverbal cues of others. They often show a display of interest in others physically that we don't see their masculine counterparts doing. They tend to constrict themselves physically and take up less space than a masculine counterpart, and they use touch for affiliation and tend to be touched more by both men and women. They often restrict their body gestures. Men, on the other hand, use nonverbal behavior to signal power and status, often to assert themselves through voice fluctuations, through pitch and tone, as well as their gestures. They command territory through their use of proxemics, and they often hide their emotions from public display by maintaining composure over their paralanguage as well as their facial expression. The hard part about this is where we see communication between those of a masculine speech community and those of a feminine speech community breaking down. Women are more skilled than men at interpreting behaviors and identifying emotions. Men, however, often can understand or see anger before a woman can. We think that this is for a couple of different reasons. We're going to look at these reasons through many of the theories that we discussed in Chapter 2. First of all, let's look at biological theory. Biological theory says men and women differ in their use of nonverbal behavior because women's right brains are specialized. Cognitive development theory says that women are encouraged from childhood on to be more sensitive to others, and therefore they are more likely to read nonverbal behavior. Standpoint theory says, at this point in time in history, women are conditioned to take care of others, and that includes being able to read their needs and feelings. Culturally, we value women sustaining and building relationships in a community. So both cultural theory and standpoint theory would support that the use of nonverbal communication by women is in order to do those things. Men, on the other hand, are culturally adept at displaying power, initiating and achieving conversations based on, from a cultural theoretical perspective, the way that they've been raised to use nonverbal behavior. So we look at what's normal. If you look at page 155 in your textbook, Gendered Lives, you will see a really interesting study that sees normal as being the masculine mode of behavior rather than the feminine mode. That is the end of Chapter 6. Make sure you take the opportunity to look at each of those quick links that were posted so that you can support this material with those videos.